Do you remember NASA's Hidden Figures? The woman whose math was behind the first American manned spaceflight during the space race? Well, across the pond, Britain had its own hidden figures. Women engineers and mathematicians in the Royal Aircraft Establishment, whose work in flight, safety, and space research helped shape modern aerospace. I spoke with Dr. Nina Baker, an independent engineering historian based in Scotland, to learn their story. Thank you so much for joining us today, Nina. Let's get started by learning about who it is that we're going to be talking about today.
Well, we're going to talk about three different women in the mid to late 20th century in Britain, of many women who worked at the Royal Aircraft Establishment. From immediately after the First World War until the 1990s, it was an absolutely massive government research place in the south of England on everything to do with civil aeroplanes, military, and latterly aerospace.
Well, let's start with Beatrice Shilling. Who was she?
Beatrice Shilling started as very much a hands-on engineer. When she left school, she was apprenticed to a woman engineer who was setting up power stations and simple power grids in rural England at a time in the 1920s when many parts of Britain were still not receiving electricity. And she was seen to have, such a natural talent for engineering, especially practical engineering, that the Women's Engineering Society made it their business to find her a scholarship and send her to Manchester University. She became an expert in two kind of overlapping fields. One was how aero engines behave in very cold weather, and the other was the fuel systems for aeroplanes and eventually rockets. If you talk to people who know about World War II history and aviation history, they will know her name in Britain because she's famous for having solved a problem that plagued the Rolls-Royce Merlin engines that powered the Spitfires. They were famous in the Second World War, but they had one fundamental problem in that the fuel supply system was problematic when they were doing the kind of dogfight aerobatics, the diving and swerving to avoid the other airplanes. And the problem was a thing called the carburetor, which mixes the fuel and the air in the correct proportions that the engine needs. Because of the way these were designed, when an aeroplane was diving, the float inside this carburetor would rise up because of gravity. It was sitting on top of the fuel and the engine would flood. Now, if you've ever driven an internal combustion engine car and the engine floods, you know that you can't drive it until the fuel has gone back to the normal proportions. But this is a real problem if you're in the air because you're already diving when this happens. You're heading for the ground and you can't get your engine started again. So she looked at this problem and realized that the problem was basically about the action of gravity on this float in the fuel system. And she devised something which was called the Royal Aircraft Establishment Restrictor, which was like a tiny washer, a little disc with a sloping hole in it that would restrict the fuel flow in that situation. And although this didn't completely solve the problem, it was enough to hold the situation safe enough before a permanent change to the engines was made. This was colloquially known as Beatrice's orifice or Miss Shilling's orifice. Probably not to her face because she was a pretty tough lady. But she was famous for riding motorbikes at high speed. She raced motorbikes, and one of the things she did after developing this restrictor was she motorcycled around the RAF bases, showing the RAF technicians how to retrofit this washer into the engines.
And is this restrictor still something that we use today, or do we use a different version of it?
No, something like the restrictor was in use in various engines for well into the 1950s.
And so at the time, what was her environment like? Were there a ton of women in the field at the time?
During the First World War, quite a lot of women either got engineering training or became engineers in various ways, started to go to university, take maths and engineering courses. But after the war was over, it was very difficult for them to find work, and one of the few places that was willing to take them at all were the government research establishments, and there were others for other fields of industry. And the Royal Aircraft Establishment in particular was looking for men and women with very good maths degrees, because a lot of male maths students from the top universities, London and Cambridge in particular, had gone to war and never come back. And everybody recognized that the early years of flight, there was a lot still not understood about the basics of how an aeroplane flies and what happens, why it doesn't sometimes fly, why it crashes. And maths is at the back of all of this. So they recruited quite a number of women, mainly with maths degrees, some like Beatrice with engineering degrees, but that was less common. That's not to say there wasn't prejudice. I mean, I don't remember the chap's name, but there was the head of one of the big departments there that absolutely wouldn't have women in his buildings. And some other things were problematic. So Beatrice Shilling married a colleague, George Naylor. She never used his name professionally. She was always Miss Shilling, yeah, even after she married. But during those years, up until the late 1940s, there was a legal bar on women working in the civil service if they were married. And so the Royal Aircraft Establishment had to find ways around this for Beatrice and other women. In Beatrice's case, she was promoted and promoted and promoted, but technically on the books, she was put down as temporary. So even though she eventually came to lead her own department, even though she was there for decades, she was officially on a temporary contract. So that was one of the ways around it. Another woman who also became very senior, instead of making it official, they kept asking for special one-off payments for this woman in order to keep her on the same, because the women were also paid 2/3 of what the men were paid. So, in order to stop women going off to the aeronautical industry where they would be paid better, they kept giving them these sort of special bonuses to bring their pay up to male grade without actually paying them on the male grade.
Wow. I'm sure if there's prejudice in the work field, that there's probably also similar prejudice in education, but I wonder whether there were concrete restrictions imposed on women or whether by and large women were allowed the same access as men.
I think you had to be pretty determined. She would have been the only woman in the engineering department, only woman student. Maths, not so much, because maths had always been a respectable entry point to higher education for women, because a lot of such women would then go on to teach maths at school. Some of the women who took maths degrees and who ended up at the Royal Aircraft Establishment, their parents probably paid for them to go to university on the expectation that they would go on to become teachers in secondary schools, but they moved into this other field. But Beatrice, she bought her own motorbike at the age of 14, and by the time she was at university, she'd bought a much bigger one and was racing it at Brooklands racetrack. And the guy she married at the Royal Aircraft Establishment, George Naylor, she wouldn't marry him until he had beaten her doing fast laps around the Brooklands racetrack. So she was one of, I think, only 4 women ever to get the Brooklands Gold Star for going around the racetrack on a motorbike at 100 miles an hour. And he had to beat that before she would agree to marry him. So, she was a tough nut.
Sounds like she has quite a determined personality.
It's just that she did so much more than work on the Spitfire. And yet that's the one thing that she's remembered for. She was also an expert from her wartime work on aeroplanes in very cold weather. After the war, there was a very famous tragedy, the Munich air crash, in which a large number of famous British footballers died. And to begin with, this was blamed on the pilot failing to de-ice the wings before taking off. Actually, she was able to prove it was not his fault. It was actually the runway had slush on it that hadn't been cleared, and that's what slowed him down to below the safe takeoff speed, and that's why the crash happened. And she did quite a lot of work on runway surfaces, to the extent that she was invited over to America to brief NASA on ideas for runways for what would ultimately become the shuttle. This must have been very, very early days of them thinking, what could we do if we had a very fast, very heavy plane that could go up into space and come back again?
Wow. I mean, she sounds like someone who really, I'm curious what the perception of her at the time was, because I know that changes, looking back, we might feel a certain way, but.
Well, it is said that her nickname behind her back, not to her face. She was actually quite a formal person. She expected to be addressed as Miss Shilling, not as Beatrice or as B. Her friends and family called her B, but at work she was Miss Shilling. But her nickname was said to be Tilly, which was short for utility, because she was a very physically plain-looking woman who dressed in very plain clothes. The Royal Aircraft Establishment no longer exists, but people my age and older who used to work there all say the same thing about the various women who they knew latterly who worked there. They wouldn't suffer fools gladly. These were no-nonsense women, all of them. And I think that in a sense they had found their home. They all had their one narrow thing that they were obsessed about. And that was the norm.
You know, we talked about this right at the top, but I think it would be worth revisiting as a kind of culmination of what it is that we've been talking about, which is this idea of women behind the scenes doing things and us not learning about them and their contributions to society.
Well, the wonderful American book and film about the black women who worked as mathematicians for NASA was an absolute revelation to everybody. I remember going to see it with a group of women engineers here, and I was crying at the end. It was so moving. What they did, what they achieved, what they had to battle through. Now, the battles for the women I'm talking about, these were all white women, largely from middle-class backgrounds, so a certain level of privilege within the British system. But nevertheless, being women was a barrier. And they were working for the government, which, you know, the work is not something that normally hits the headlines. Their names weren't in the press. They were definitely the backroom girls doing this work with their male colleagues that progressed technology. I mean, the interesting thing is, at the time, these women were recognised. Beatrice Shilling got an OBE. So people at the time, their peer group recognised them. So well, it's up to people like you and I to bring them back out into the daylight, because these women were known in their day, but that day is a while ago now, and I'm trying to make sure they don't get forgotten.
Join us next week when we learn about Anne Burns, who rode in test flights to study turbulence and make flying safer for everyone.